So thank you very much indeed for having me here in South Australia. I really accept just about any invitation to come to South Australia. Every time I've come here in my working career, it's always been not only enjoyable, but a rich and rewarding experience, so an easy thing to say yes to. But also, I've got a very personal attachment to public servants. Is this the mic or is that the mic? It's all here. Okay, so I don't have to worry about that so much. So just to start with this, a few days before Christmas, I was in England. It was actually a sad time because my mother had just died. We'd just buried her. I was in my brother's house, and he is a senior public servant in the UK, and he was taking calls in the midst of this great sadness for our family from the department. He works for the Department of Transport. And the Department of Transport were under pressure from Number 10 because Number 10 wanted to put out an announcement on Boxing Day. Not a big announcement, not about the beginning of something important or the end of something terrible, but a small announcement about utility companies having to pay rent to do their work on roads in order to encourage them to do their work out of peak hours. It was a minor announcement, but they were putting pressure on to do it on Boxing Day at a time when, as I'm sure you know, in England, no one can get through anything, even a rerun of Hercule Poirot with their eyes open. So the chances that they wanted to listen to an announcement from the British Transport Minister about lane closures was very, very small. And there was my brother taking the phone call and concerned that he was going to have to ask one of his juniors to be on duty for the minister that day. So he volunteered to do it himself. And I was annoyed with him at the time. I was angry that he would go along with this ludicrous thing. And then I remembered what it is about him and about public servants that I so admire. And it is that self-effacement, that self-effacing dedication to duty. And so everything that I bring here today to talk to you about comes from that place of great respect that I have. In a world, in my world in particular, where personality is becoming too important, where brand journalism is starting to play much too great a role, where brand and not work is the thing that matters for journalists, to see this example of that self-effacement, that dedication, again, just reinforced everything I think about the world of public servants. Now, Australia in the Year of Uncertainty. When we had a discussion about what we were going to talk about today, the organisers of the event urged me, please, not to rain too much gloom down on you. And Kim clearly did a different job and talked about the extraordinary possibilities there are in South Australia. But I have come bringing, if not gloom, at least some warnings that attach to that Year of Uncertainty. I've just been reading a very sober publication, in fact, which is from the Munich Security Conference, the 54th Munich Security Conference. It was titled 44 Pages on the New World Order, and I underline the fact that this is normally a very sober publication. So a big title, The New World Order, and an asterisk, and then at the bottom of the front page, the line, or lack thereof. So I know that I'm not alone in seeing a great deal of uncertainty and potential difficulty in the year ahead. Now, it's at that conference that the US National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, stated that the case against Russian interference in the 2016 election was now incontrovertible, to which Donald Trump immediately tweeted that his own National Security Advisor had forgotten to say at the same time that the election result was not affected by the Russians and the only collusion was between Russia and crooked Hillary. So, who's game to say that we shouldn't be feeling somewhat pessimistic with that sort of expression coming out of the White House? So really, this is my St. Crispin's Day speech for public servants, if you like, because amongst the challenges, though, I want to talk about the shared values that we have, the shared values that should enable us to confront all of the uncertainties without being totally consumed by dread, Kim notwithstanding. It's instructive, Nick brought up the killing season, and it is instructive that in that series, we did 144 interviews, and I've always said that I should have been given, we're between friends here, right? I should have been given a little medal because I interviewed Kevin Rudd for 13 of those hours. But out of 144 interviews, my favourite interview and the favourite of many of the viewers, and certainly everybody who worked on the programme, was a public servant, Ken Henry. And the reason for that is that Ken Henry was the only person that we met in the series who was prepared to acknowledge that he had played a role, he had made mistakes, and that he had spent time looking back and working out what he could have done better. As the Rudd government hit problems in 2010, he was the only one who had bothered to reflect that he might have played a small role, of course, because we know it wasn't Ken Henry that brought that government down, but it was that, once again, that self-effacement and the desire to reflect on what he had done. Now, this was a very fast-paced series. We upped the editing speed. It moved very, very quickly. But at that point in the series, which was the fulcrum of the series, where we were starting to examine what had caused that momentous and, in Ken Henry's mind, very poor decision to remove a sitting Prime Minister in his first term, we slowed the series right down so that the exchange with Ken Henry could be seen in all of its detail. And it's something that when I go back occasionally and look at the series, that is the moment that I, again, find the most rewarding, because it is Ken saying that what he should have done at that moment when they were hitting trouble, he should have gone to the Prime Minister and told him that some of the demands he was making on the public service in particular were unreasonable. So Ken Henry, I think, the hero of that series. Now, I would say one of the things I pick up from Ken Henry there, as with my brother, is that self-effacement, which is why I struck out the awards from Nick's introduction. I think it's something we share, that a self-effacing commitment to seriousness in public broadcasting, as in the public service, is central to what we do. But first, let's just talk a little bit more about the challenges. Now, since that period that the killing season covered, that tumultuous churn of prime ministers, which I think is we're very clearly still living with the consequences of. Obviously, the Liberal Party picked up the game and did the same thing, and we're still in the consequences of that. Of course, since then, the media cycle has sped up even further. It's faster, it's more reactive, and the third rail, social media, has transmogrified really since then into something vastly different, really, from the almost quirky preoccupation it was when Kevin Rudd scored his first 1 million followers. Barack Obama, when he left the White House, used his last speech in office to warn about the inherent dangers of social media in separating us from each other. It's the weakness that the Russians exploited so brilliantly in their black operation against the US, because that's what it was Black Ops. An operation that sought to amplify existing divisions. Yesterday, you may have noticed one of the social media behemoths, Twitter, started removing a number of the Russian bots from the system, which meant that some people woke up with fewer followers than they had the night before. And in spite of everything that had come out in the preceding days, there's a whole number of people on Twitter complaining that their followers have been removed, even when those followers are bots from a factory in St. Petersburg, from an office building in St. Petersburg. President Trump, it was reported, enjoyed the first 24 hours of coverage of Mueller's indictment of the Russian troll factory, until somebody pointed out that it wasn't actually a good thing for him. What followed were 10 extraordinary tweets overnight, attacking all sorts of people, concluding with the phrase that the Russians must be laughing their asses off. So, why does this matter? Not just because of the extraordinary spectacle, but because the social media tail is more and more frequently wagging the media dog. Now, that is, of course, content created to drive social media engagement. Now, the rights and wrongs of that depend largely on the content. Some of it is innovative, some of it is very good, but there are red flags, and I want to just talk a little bit about that. I'm sure quite a few of you follow US politics closely. There's a new site called Axios. I don't know how many of you follow it. It's a startup that was founded by two guys who had left Politico, and they said they wanted it to be a combination of Twitter and The Economist, which is completely impossible and should give you some indication about the real nature of the product. The way it works is the stories are extremely short. It starts with a punchy paragraph using lots of vernacular, and then a little box that tells you how many words there are in the rest of the story if you want to read it, and it's not a large number of words. So if you're feeling brave, you might go another 150 words, but you don't have to. We've kind of given you the story. But then if you go to the next section, it's laid out in memo form. So these are no longer even stories, they are memos, they're bullet points. And it makes me worry that some of the powers that be in the ABC may be licking their chops at the thought that more of our journalism could look like that. Now, sometimes Axios does a very good job. It has some very good journalists. But the idea that you can deliver news in this crucial, complex time in note form, utterly devoid of context, is something that worries me. So each of their stories, if you like, is a memo that exists in its own right for its own moment, and then is gone, but it's not part of something larger, wider, with context and narrative. And it's designed for hundreds of thousands of people across the US, hunched over their terminals, bored, playing with their phones. A story pops up, they get a little thrill, and they can pass it on to a friend saying, have you seen this? It's particularly dangerous when you have a White House, of course, that is at war with itself. Nieman Lab has also criticised the style, because of the lack of context. Scoops are important, but they shouldn't take away the job of painstakingly holding power to account. Scoops are important in that, but it's not the only thing. Some of that is really long, slow, boring work. And it reminds me that so much of what we do at Four Corners depends on getting out information that people don't want. And it occurred to me that for all of my tales about loving public servants, we have, of course, occasionally run stories with audio of public servants doing just the wrong thing. I don't know if you remember, but last year we had a New South Wales public servant clearly aiding water-guzzling farmers at the expense of ordinary people in South Australia. So I did mean to say at the beginning that I'm sure that none of those people have crept into this room, but if any one of you has, come and see me afterwards. I promise you the truth will set you free. Now, I was saying before that going back to memo form reporting and not painstakingly achieved bits of footage that will expose the New South Wales government for what it is. What's the problem? It's a problem, of course, when the White House is roiled in chaos in the way that it is, because there's always someone available to leak about his or her enemy. It encourages stories by backgrounding non-attributable remarks on the enemy. One of the things that we did when we were making The Killing Season at the very beginning when I came onto the project was to rule out background sources. We could have preparatory conversations, but no one was allowed to provide information that would form the series unless they were in it. So putting a much higher threshold on people. If you want to say something about someone, I'm only going to include it if you appear. And so I think, with the exception of Penny Wong, who I certainly don't put into this category, but those absences, Mark Arbib, David Feeney, the absences tell you about those people who were not prepared to stand up, Bill Shorten, shall we say, who were not prepared and make their comments in public. So the importance of comments and analysis that can be attributed, the Axios model works against that. Now, of course, at the centre of everything I'm talking about in the US sits Donald Trump. This is a president, and this is a question about ethics. Kim and I were talking about this at the beginning, that when we all started looking at America, and I'm not saying there weren't some interesting things that were brought to light by the election, there certainly were. But I've passed the point where I found it picaresque and entertaining. I've reached the point where I'm finding it deeply disturbing because something that I thought was an anomaly, I think, is turning to a new norm in America. This is a president, the only president ever, who declared in his 2 presidential runs that he was going to make money while running for president, and that's quite an extraordinary thought. Today, his son, Donald Jr., is in India on a real estate boosting trip. He's also making a foreign policy speech for his father, selling tickets to real estate events in India that are tagged as getting the ear of the president. The officer of White House ethics has resigned because it was clear to him very early on that the Trumps were not going to abide by post-Watergate protocols. So I read a piece in Rolling Stone talking about Donald Trump in a kind of Hunter S. Thompson riff, and this is what they said. The irresistible rise of Donald Trump is the American media's payback for years of appealing to the lowest common denominator. The lowest common denominator is now the president. Who did we think, they ask, would come to prominence in our rage-filled media environment? And they're right. And just a small point to everybody in this room, the more you click on, the more you watch, the more you reward the rage-filled media, the more you'll get it. So we respond always to what you do, to your viewing, listening, and reading habits. So to some degree, it's in your hands. Now, the current state of play in the US, of course, has been countered to some degree by the resurgence of great reporting and great newspapers, the Washington Post and the New York Times, slugging it out in a way we haven't seen since Watergate. That Trump bump has also delivered new numbers to CNN, to the Boston Globe, to the New Yorker, and with the admixture of Brexit, to the Financial Times in the UK. But at the same time, Breitbart and InfoWars are also enjoying renewed success. You could add Fox News, although the Post recently observed that Fox News was squishy compared to Breitbart, which had really, truly captured the Trump voter. But this is the warning for us, because this is where the America's Shared project reaches its apotheosis and carries its sharpest warnings to us. In the near obliteration in the US of what Roger Cohen, New York Times columnist, calls venues of encounter. Venues of encounter. These are places for public discourse where people can come, people with different views can come, hear and participate in rational debate. Cohen describes in its place the chasm that's opened up in the US, threatening really the fabric of that nation. The motto of the United States, decided on at the time of the Continental Congress, declared independence from Great Britain, out of many, one. It's a wonderful idea, a pluribus unum, out of many, one. It's something that we understand in Australia. But really, is it a pluribus unum anymore? Those places of rational debate have disappeared. An ideological chasm has opened up, as I said. The town hall the other day after the Florida shooting might suggest that someone in the White House communications shop has begun to understand some of this, but I think we'll have to wait and see. The more complex the issues, of course, the more important it is for all of us to create just those places of encounter, a place for everybody to come where everyone feels included. Remember Charlottesville, so much has happened since then that it feels like an event that took place in the distant past. But it was an event that was both shocking and sui generis, and it contains warnings for us. Neo-Nazis, white supremacists, open members of the Ku Klux Klan, marching, chanting slogans, a violent protest about the removal of a statue, a debate that carried on here for a little while. This was a history war, not in the Australian sense, but one with fists and clubs and guns and eventually with murder. Now, in the immediate aftermath, that's when Trump faced his first existential moment, the first existential moment of his presidency. Not just because he failed to condemn the violence, but because he declined explicitly to put those events on a moral plane, thus abrogating the duty of a leader to unite his people. In that moment, he not only gave succor to extremists, he again designated himself as a leader only to a portion of the American people, a pluribus unum no more. In the days that followed, the chasm that opened up was revealed. There was no place for Americans to come together to discuss what had occurred. Soon afterwards, there was a poll done by CBS that said that 68% of Republican voters agreed with Trump that both sides had been responsible for what happened. It reminded me of my very first reporting assignment in Australia. I was following Pauline Hanson around in her first iteration. And we arrived at a location on the Gold Coast. It was a big empty hall on an industrial estate, and the protesters were drumming on the this great big metal roller door on the outside of the factory, warehouse building, drumming with their feet, making an extraordinary amount of noise to drown out Pauline Hanson trying to make her speech. And at the time I was shocked. I thought, you have to listen. You have to let her speak. Not only is it possible that she might say something that you find interesting, but the danger that we create by trying to stop people from speaking is that we end up with a situation that we have in America where no one comes together and where people only talk to each other, precisely the warning that Barack Obama gave us. Even before Charlottesville happened in the US, there were members of the Trump campaign warning about the potential for civil war. I don't know if you know Roger Stone, the Trump whisperer, an extraordinary, strange man, but he said this, which I wrote down at the time because it shocked me. He said that any congressman or congresswoman voting to impeach Trump should fear for their lives. He said, just try it and you'll have a spasm of violence in this country and insurrection. Now, there used to be more trust in the American media, and think about this when you make your own choices with the media here. They used to have national commercial broadcasters that crossed geographic time zones, they crossed ideological zones, many of them led by towering figures of journalism. When Walter Cronkite made pronouncements about the Vietnam War, the nation listened, particularly those ones where he started to say that the war, contrary to what was being said by the White House, was not being won. But that consensus has completely fractured in the US, and we have seen the beginnings of the same fracture opening up here. Our responsibility, my responsibility, your responsibility, is to ensure that we maintain a place where those great debates can happen, and they can happen civilly. Civil society, not Roger Stone's civil war. Now, media commentator Jay Rosen, he talks about my job, and he says that I shouldn't do what I do, which is to say that I'm objective. He says that I should abandon the pretense of neutrality and declare all my interests. I couldn't disagree more. It's becoming a more and more popular theme in media that people are supposed to declare all of the things that they do and think and say and vote in order that you can judge what I'm saying. I don't agree that it is a pretense of neutrality. I think it's an open mind, and it's the thing that we all need to have, and I think it gets harder as you get older to look at new situations. It's fantastic to bring experience to a new problem, but to ensure that that experience doesn't become an excuse for prejudgment. I can be concerned about the mental torment of people living in camps and then work for months and months and months with my colleagues pursuing the people smugglers who brought them there, who exploited them, trafficked them for profit. I can also hold concerns for animals packed into ships and taken overseas in the live cattle trade. I can have those thoughts about the animals and still talk to a farmer in the Northern Territory about the reasons why that's what he does for a living. That's not a pretense of neutrality. That is an open mind. Now, more rubbish was written about that particular story than I think any other programme I've ever made. We were accused of inventing the footage, doctoring the footage. Lynn White was accused of paying for some of the footage that we used. We were even accused of inserting the sounds of distressed animals into the audio track, which is quite an extraordinary notion. After the programme went to air, so much rubbish was being talked about what we'd done and what it meant that I called my strongest critic, who was the head of the Cattlemen's Association in Western Australia, and said that I was concerned about the things that were being said about the programme because it put his own members in a difficult position, that they were being exposed to further losses in the industry, actually, if they believed that this wasn't true, that it would continue in the same way. And I felt I should go over to Western Australia, go into the Lion's Den and tell them why I'd done it, that we hadn't tricked it up, and this is what the situation really was. Of course, they declined my request, which I thought was a great shame, but I tried. Wound into that fracturing of the media that I'm talking about, of course, is the fracturing of politics. Consider the threats from Europe, the extraordinary dishonest debate over Brexit on both sides, the rise of the far right in Europe. We've got parties with openly fascist ideology gaining ground and shifting the mainstream. There's a retreat from democracy in Poland. Fascist leaders in Slovakia say the elites want to make people ashamed of their history. The fracturing of the consensus here, of course, was clearly exacerbated by the drama of our own political upheavals, those that I spent so long looking at in the killing season. 2 prime ministers unseated by their colleagues without reaching the end of their first term made me feel sorry for Kevin Rudd and Tony Abbott, which is quite an extraordinary position to hold. Did any of those conspirators consider, I wonder, the deeper cost to stability and the fracturing of faith in the electorate that sprung from those actions? I don't think so. And in fact, if you look at the Twitter feed that came out yesterday of a Victorian Labor member, you might say that, including that extraordinary Labor-only special word, rat-fucking, that nothing has changed. I came of age during the Thatcher years in Britain, and I watched from fortunately, a very close position as she was unseated by the Tory grandees. And at the time, I registered something that appalled me, which was the snobbery that was a deep part of what they were doing at the time. She was the first female Prime Minister that I knew, and I resented that they would denigrate a woman who, without their advantages, had got a chemistry degree from Oxford. This is politics aside, but the denigration of her as a woman and as a lower class woman in their awful words was something that shocked me then. It also meant I was very well primed for the mistreatment of Julia Gillard, rough and vile, when it came here. But at least the unseating of Thatcher happened when her political imagination, whether you liked it or didn't like it, but that political imagination was spent. It's the public who pays when any of us with any power to shape their lives forgets for a moment that they come first. With the complex debates that Kim outlined that lie ahead, what do we have to do to remind ourselves and the people we work with that the individual must always be at the heart of what we do, to hear the voices of the weak and the unrepresented, as well as the strong and the very well represented? Thank you very much indeed. We don't quite have a K Street yet, but I suspect it's coming in South Australia. You can't have big policy debates if you don't know who those unrepresented people are and very precisely how they sound. There was a very noisy, shrill argument in the year that I made Hitting Home, a series on domestic violence, about the true nature of domestic violence. And I remember sitting on the edge of a bed with a young boy we called him Joe. He was about 10 years old. He was playing PlayStation, and he was telling me about the night that his stepfather had beaten his mother up and punched her in the face and broken her jaw in front of him. And this young boy was straining to think of the worst thing he could possibly say to his stepfather by way of reproach. And he thought about it for a while, and he said, I'm going to go up to him and I'm going to say, "You're not a very good father." Joe wasn't poor in the awful debate of that year. Joe wasn't in that situation because his parents were from a housing commission suburb in Western Sydney. They were there because his stepfather was inadequate. When you ask police prosecutors for the most common feature in perpetrators of domestic violence, once you've got through the alcohol problem, the word inadequacy is what comes out first. How do you design public policy around human flaws? Because we're asking the police to do more and more to combat society's ills. And when we talk about the inequality that's likely to come when you have a very rapid change in job structure, as you're going to have in South Australia, these things should be in the forefront of all our minds. My job is to show what the problems are. I'm afraid it's your job to work out a policy that, in the case of domestic violence, finds it out before it has its insidious grip on a family. There's another danger, I think, in ignoring the individual at the heart of everything that we do. I spent some time in a housing commission in Western Sydney, some months, following around a group of children, poor children. And the thing that horrified me the most about that particular filming was that the children aged 10 and 11 had already decided, beyond any doubt whatsoever, that their lives were predetermined, that they were going to end up poor, they were going to end up with the same lives as their parents. At 10 and 11, they knew there was no way out for them. I don't know what's become of the lives of those children, and actually thinking about talking to you made me think I need to get back in touch with them and find out. But I do know that whatever happened to them, if we ignore the most vulnerable voices in the work that we do, you take the risk that they will adhere to someone offering false, divisive hope. Donald Trump claims to speak for the forgotten America, and there is some evidence that that statement is true. We have a responsibility, every one of us in this room, to mitigate the uncertainty that people feel about the future, and that's by preparing the ideas base. I think it's a slogan word, but I don't mind that one, for what we know is coming. I saw just the other day, it's a small thing, but I saw the other day that the UK has decided that they're going to ban petrol cars by 2040. That will no doubt keep my brother very busy. But I wondered, with the British public mired in those dead-end Brexit debates, where they're going to go to get proper explanations and preparation and honest descriptions of the implications of big decisions like that. My mother, the one that we'd just buried, she used to write very strong letters. As I was going through the house after her death, I found one she'd just written to the chairman of the Tory party. So I'm going to make this point in her name because she left us recently, and I'm thinking about her all the time. She'd written to the chairman of the Tory party complaining about the Brexit referendum. She was against Brexit, which set her apart from the people in her part of England and set her apart from her own twin brother. But she was complaining to the chairman of the Tory party, not just for the decision to hold the referendum, but for the poor language that they had used in holding the debate. She was complaining about empty slogans and phrases, and she did it very well. So, as I say in her name, this is the point I want to conclude on, which is a subject very close to my heart, and that is language. Direct, strong, active language whose purpose is clarity. What possible reason do you or I or anyone have for using language which makes a difficult life harder to understand? When I was a teenager, I loved poetry, and I used to write to the British poet Philip Larkin. I used to write on, you know that note paper that girls used to have with either ponies or flowers in the corner? So I used to write to Philip Larkin, the darkest poet in the English language, on flowery note paper. And I used to ask him in this chirpy 13-year-old way, or 14, why is it that your poems say that life is first something and then death? It isn't. Life is great. And Philip Larkin replied. So I would write great long screeds, and Philip Larkin would reply from the University of Hull, where he worked, the library, with one line referring to another poem with an even bleaker view of humanity. And we carried on this correspondence for a while. So when I sit down to write anything now, I have those two letters, or the two types of letters in my head next to each other. Mine with the flowery notepaper, and Philip Larkin's terse responses, to ensure that I avoid too many words, that I avoid the sort of Rudd-like piling up of clauses where the sense of the meaning gets completely lost. And I'm going to ask you to do the same thing. We have in our daily lives, we have very different challenges. Mine, as I said at the beginning, in part is against the speed, the kinds of things that Axios are doing that I'm sure we'll see more of here, and in particular against the encroachment of brand journalism, which I loathe, that raises the individual over the body of work. But I suggest too, as I did at the beginning, that we also have shared values. What we're up against is huge. Just to pick out a few things. Today, or I think yesterday, the Arctic recorded temperatures 45 degrees above normal. Donald Trump said in the town hall meeting, as Kim and I were discussing after the Florida shooting, if you had a teacher who is adept at firearms, they could very well end the attack very quickly. Donald Jr. tweeted about the commercial success of his trip to India as he was about to make his foreign policy speech. At home, Crown in Melbourne announced their results, saying that in the 6 months to December, gamblers lost $618 million in the main floor gambling room at the Crown Casino in Melbourne. $618 million. Despite being one of the biggest pokie venues in the world, they refused to say how much of that came from poker machines, but the figure is estimated at about 575 million. Our politics in Australia is drenched in personality contests. You'll notice that I've stayed away from the awful story of the day because of the last few days, because it's too dreary, really. It's not much above the television program Married at First Sight. To be honest, it's such an awful picture at the moment. Not so much your local politics, I would say, but at a federal level. It's such an awful sight that really I could understand why anybody would want to pick up their bag and their conference pack and rush off to a hut in the woods. But I'm afraid you don't have that opportunity. The warnings are clear enough. Over to you.